You don't speak unless you're certain, Captain Robert Hayes said, not looking at her as he pulled off his gloves, his voice carrying across the field station like a rule carved in stone. The canvas walls trembled slightly in the late afternoon wind, carrying the smell of antiseptic and damp earth. Somewhere beyond the tents, engines idled, boots moved, a war continuing just out of sight, but inside this space, everything narrowed to breath, to hands, to decisions measured in seconds. Elena Weiss stood near the back table, still, almost invisible, her gray dress marked with the small red cross that no one here trusted, her hands folded lightly in front of her, not defensive, not submissive, simply waiting. She had been here for 3 days, transferred with other prisoners, processed, assigned, observed, and judged before she ever spoke a word, or rather, before she chose not to speak at all. Hayes had noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't react. Not when orders were barked, not when questions were asked, not even when one of the younger medics muttered that German nurses were trained for propaganda, not for real work. She had simply looked, once, then lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in calculation. Hayes had seen that look before, in officers, in men who measured risk before moving, but this was different. This was quiet in a way that unsettled him. So he did what men in command often do when something unsettles them: he reduced it. Simplified it, made it smaller than himself. We don't need ghosts in this tent, he had said earlier, just loud enough for the others to hear. A few had laughed, not cruelly, just enough to align themselves with him, to establish order, to define roles, and she had not answered, not even a glance, just that same stillness, as if the moment had passed through her without leaving a mark. Now, hours later, the light had shifted. Long shadows stretched across the wooden tables, instruments laid out in precise rows, the air heavier, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. Hayes moved between stations, checking, correcting, his boots making soft, steady sounds against the packed dirt floor. Control lived in those small sounds, in the rhythm of movement, in knowing where everyone stood and what they were capable of. He paused briefly near Elena, not turning his head. If you have something to say, say it, he added, almost as an afterthought, but she did not respond, not a word, not a movement, only her eyes, lifting just enough to meet the scene unfolding in front of her, attentive, precise, absorbing everything. And in that moment, though Hayes could not name it yet, the room had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet way a storm changes direction before anyone feels the wind, because the truth was simple, and it would reveal itself soon enough. She had not stayed silent because she had nothing to offer, she had stayed silent because she was waiting for the exact moment when it would matter. The change came without warning, not with noise but with absence, a pause where there should have been certainty. A young private lay on the table near the center of the tent, his breathing uneven, not dramatic, just wrong in a way trained eyes could not ignore. One medic adjusted the bandage. Again, another checked his pulse. Voices stayed low but tighter now, each second stretching longer than it should. Captain Hayes stepped in, his presence immediate, grounding. He had seen situations turn before, had learned to read the small signals others missed. What changed? He asked, not loudly, but the room answered him by going still. The medic hesitated, then spoke. Vitals are dropping, sir, we cannot figure out why. Hayes leaned closer, watching, measuring, nothing obvious, no panic. Just something slipping quietly out of place. He gave a short nod. Try again, he said, because sometimes repetition revealed what the first attempt did not, but the second attempt brought the same result. And the silence that followed was heavier now, not confusion, something closer to doubt. Across the room, Elena had already seen it, not the symptom, but the pattern behind it. Her eyes moved once from the man's hands to his breathing, then to the positioning of the bandage, then to the tray beside him. Something small, something misaligned. She did not rush forward, did not interrupt, because timing mattered more than urgency. She waited, one breath, two, until Hayes stepped back half an inch, just enough space for a decision to exist. Then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, simply forward, her steps quiet against the dirt floor. One of the medics noticed her and frowned, instinctively blocking her path. Stay back, he said, not harsh, just certain. But she did not stop. Her eyes shifted past him to Hayes, not challenging, not pleading, just present, steady, asking without words. Hayes felt it before he understood it, that same stillness from earlier, but now it carried weight, purpose. He looked at her fully for the first time, not as a prisoner, not as an inconvenience, but as someone who had already reached a conclusion he had not yet seen. You see something, he said, more statement than question. She gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and in that moment, the room narrowed again, not to the soldier, but to the space between two people deciding who would act. Hayes held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, measuring risk, measuring trust, then he stepped aside, just enough, no announcement, no permission spoken aloud. But everyone in the room felt it, the shift. Elena stepped in, her hands moving with quiet certainty, adjusting, correcting, aligning what had been slightly off, nothing dramatic, nothing forceful, just precision, the kind that comes from repetition, from understanding rather than assumption. The medic who had blocked her watched closely now, no longer resisting, learning. The seconds passed, then something changed, subtle, but undeniable. The rhythm steadied, the tension in the room loosened by degrees. Not relief, not yet, but direction. Hayes remained where he was, watching every movement, every choice, and for the first time since she arrived, he said nothing at all, because he understood something that did not need words. Control had not been taken from him, it had been shown to him, and he had almost missed it. No one spoke when it was over, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything spoken would have been too small for what had just happened. The soldier's breathing settled into a steady rhythm, not perfect, not strong, but stable, and in a place like this, stability was everything. Elena stepped back the same way she had stepped forward, without claiming space, without drawing attention. Her hands returned to stillness at her sides, her eyes no longer fixed on the table but lowered slightly, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if it had never belonged to her in the first place. One of the medics exhaled quietly, the kind of breath a person does not realize they were holding. Another adjusted the blanket with more care than before, small gestures returning to the room, human again. Captain Hayes remained where he stood, his gaze still on the space Elena had just left, replaying every movement, not the outcome, but the decisions, the sequence, the clarity of it. He had seen skilled hands before, had worked alongside some of the best. But this had been different. There had been no hesitation, no need for confirmation, only certainty expressed through action. He looked down briefly at his own gloves, still in his hand, then back at her, and for the first time, the question forming in his mind was not about control, but about understanding. Where did you train? He asked, his voice quieter now, not carrying across the room like before, but directed, intentional. Elena paused, not turning immediately, as if considering whether the question required an answer. Then she faced him, her posture unchanged, composed. Munich, she said, her accent present but clear, the single word settling into the space between them. No explanation followed, no attempt to justify, just fact. Hayes nodded once, absorbing it, not as information, but as context he had failed to consider. One of the younger medics looked between them, curiosity replacing earlier doubt. She saw something we missed, he said, half to himself. And Hayes did not correct him, because it was true, and truth, once seen, had a way of reshaping everything around it. He stepped closer to the table, examining the adjustments Elena had made, subtle changes, precise, each one connected to the next in a way that formed a complete picture, not guesswork, not luck, knowledge, applied at exactly the right moment. He straightened, turning back toward her, but this time there was no edge in his expression, no need to assert anything, only a quiet recalibration. You will stay on this rotation, he said, not as a command meant to reinforce authority, but as a decision that acknowledged reality. Elena inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in agreement, as if she had already expected it, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible passed between them, not gratitude, not apology, something more balanced, recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. Outside, the engines continued. The war did not pause, but inside the tent, something had shifted that would not easily return to what it was before, because Hayes understood now, not through words, not through explanation, but through what he had witnessed with his own eyes, that silence was not absence, and that the person he had dismissed without a second thought had been the one holding the answer all along. And from that moment forward, every time she chose not to speak, he would listen more closely than ever before. The evening settled slowly over the field. station, not with darkness but with a soft dimming of edges, the kind that made everything feel closer, more contained. Lantern light replaced the fading sun, casting long, steady shadows across the canvas walls, and with it came a different rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, the rush of urgency giving way to something steadier, more reflective. Captain Hayes stood just outside the tent for a moment, listening, not to commands or engines, but to the absence of chaos, a rare and fragile thing in a place like this. He had removed his jacket, sleeves rolled neatly, the discipline still there, but less rigid now, as if something inside him had shifted its weight. When he stepped back inside, his eyes moved automatically across the room, checking, measuring, but they paused when they found her. Elena was at a side table, organizing instruments with the same precision she had shown earlier, each item placed exactly where it belonged. Not hurried, not hesitant, simply correct. One of the medics approached her, asking a question in a tone that carried none of the earlier doubt. She answered briefly, her voice low, then returned to her work. No effort to extend the moment, no need to claim it. Hayes watched this from a distance, recognizing something he had overlooked before. Respect in this room had not been given through rank or orders, it had shifted through action, and once shifted, it did not easily return to its original form. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away, not interrupting, just observing. Elena sensed him before he spoke, not turning immediately, but acknowledging his presence in the slight pause of her hands. You saw it before anyone else, he said finally, his voice even, not questioning, not challenging, just stating what had become undeniable. She placed one instrument down carefully before responding. It was there, she said, her words simple, without emphasis, as if the answer required no further explanation. Hayes considered that, the simplicity of it, not a claim of skill, not an attempt to elevate herself, just an observation, and it struck him that what he had mistaken for silence had never been emptiness, it had been restraint, discipline of a different kind, one that did not need to announce itself. A medic nearby glanced over, listening without appearing to, absorbing the exchange, because in this place, every shift in tone mattered. Hayes nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate. If you see something again, he said, then paused, choosing the next words with care. You step in. It was not framed as permission, but as expectation, a subtle but important difference. Elena met his gaze briefly, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if the adjustment had been anticipated long before he spoke it. Yes, Captain, she replied, and the title carried no tension now, only acknowledgement of roles that no longer needed to be defended. Outside, a distant engine started, the world continuing its relentless motion, but inside the tent, the air held a different weight, one shaped not by orders or hierarchy, but by a quiet recalibration that would influence every decision that followed. Hayes turned to move back toward the center of the station, but not before his eyes returned to her one last time, not out of doubt, but out of a new awareness, because he understood now that the most important voice in the room might not be the one that spoke the loudest, and that sometimes, the person who said the least was the one who saw the most. The night settled deeper, and with it came the kind of stillness that made every small sound matter, the quiet clink of metal, the soft movement of fabric, the measured rhythm of breathing from the cots lined in careful rows. The field station no longer felt like a place of urgency but of watchfulness, where time stretched and every decision lingered longer than it should. Captain Hayes moved between stations with less haste now, his pace slower, not because there was less to do, but because he was noticing more details he might have dismissed hours earlier, the way one medic adjusted his posture before checking a patient, the way another paused to listen rather than act, and always, somewhere in the periphery, Elena, never central, never drawing attention, but present in a way that shaped the room without announcing itself. She worked at a small table near a lantern, the warm light outlining her hands as they moved with quiet precision, cleaning, arranging, restoring order to the tools that would be needed again. Hayes stopped a few feet away, not interrupting, just watching the rhythm of her work. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each action flowed into the next with a kind of certainty that did not need to be explained. He realized then that what he had seen earlier had not been an exception, it had been a pattern, one he had simply failed to recognize until it was placed directly in front of him. A young medic approached her, holding a small tray, uncertain. Is this right? He asked, his voice lower than before, not out of fear, but out of respect for the quiet she maintained. Elena glanced at the tray, her eyes moving quickly across its contents. Then she adjusted one item, just slightly. Now it is, she said, and nothing more. The medic nodded, absorbing the correction without embarrassment, because it had been given without judgment. Hayes watched this exchange carefully, understanding that authority in this space was no longer defined solely by rank. It had shifted into something earned in moments that could not be argued. He stepped closer, the wooden floor soft under his boots. "You do not explain much," he said, not as criticism, but as observation. Elena paused, considering the words before responding. "It is not always needed," she replied, her tone even, and Hayes found himself nodding, not because he agreed immediately, but because he recognized the truth in it. Explanation often came after certainty, and she seemed to operate in a space where certainty arrived first. A distant sound outside drew brief attention, then faded. The war continuing its constant motion beyond the canvas walls, but inside, the atmosphere held steady, shaped now by a different kind of leadership, one that did not rely on volume or force. Hayes glanced around the room, seeing it through a slightly altered lens. The medics moved with more confidence, but also with more care, as if they had learned something they could not fully articulate. He looked back at Elena. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice deliberate, "you assist directly." It was a shift in position, subtle on the surface, but significant in what it acknowledged. Elena met his gaze, not surprised, not grateful, simply accepting the change as a natural progression. "Understood," she said, and returned to her work. Hayes remained there for a moment longer, watching the quiet consistency of her actions, and it became clear to him that what had changed was not just her place in the room, but his understanding of what strength looked like, because it was not always loud, not always visible. Sometimes it stood in the corner, said nothing, and waited until the exact moment it was needed, and when it moved, everything else adjusted around it without resistance. Morning came without announcement, just a gradual return of light filtering through the canvas, soft and gray at first, then slowly sharpening the edges of everything inside the field station. The air cooler now, carrying a faint hint of dew and distant earth, the kind of morning that felt almost peaceful if one ignored where they were. Captain Hayes was already awake, standing near the entrance with a tin cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the station come back to life in small, deliberate movements. Medics checking supplies, adjusting cots, speaking in low voices that did not disturb the fragile quiet. And then he saw her. Elena was already at work, earlier than the others, her presence steady, unchanged by the shift from night to day. She moved between tables with the same controlled precision, preparing for what would come, not reacting, not waiting, but anticipating. Hayes set the cup aside, stepping further in, his boots making a soft, grounded sound against the floor. "You start early," he said, not as a remark to fill silence, but as an observation he had begun to collect about her. Elena did not look up immediately, finishing the placement of an instrument before responding. "It is quieter," she said, and there was something in that answer that suggested more than preference, something about clarity, about working in moments before noise took over. Hayes nodded slightly, understanding more than he would have the day before. A medic approached with a clipboard, reporting on overnight changes. Hayes listened, asked a few short questions, then dismissed him with a brief nod, his attention shifting back, always back, to where Elena stood, not because she demanded it, but because he had learned that the most important details often existed in the places others overlooked. "You will assist with the first case," he said, his tone even, not testing, not challenging, simply stating the next step. Elena met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes, Captain," she replied, and moved to prepare without hesitation. No adjustment period, no visible shift in demeanor, just action aligned with expectation. The station began to fill with a different kind of energy now, the quiet preparation giving way to readiness, instruments arranged, positions taken, each person settling into their role. Hayes watched as Elena stepped into the space beside the main table, not claiming it, but not avoiding it either, her hands resting lightly, waiting, observing. The others glanced at her, not with suspicion now, but with a measured curiosity, the kind that comes when respect is still new and not yet fully understood. A young medic stood opposite her, hesitating slightly before beginning. Elena noticed, not by looking directly, but by sensing the break in rhythm. "Start with what you know," she said quietly, not correcting, not instructing, just guiding the moment forward. The medic nodded, steadying himself, and began. Hayes remained just behind them, watching the interaction unfold, not intervening, not directing, allowing the process to reveal itself, and it did, in small ways. In adjustments that happened before mistakes could form, in timing that felt almost intuitive. Elena did not take control, she did not need to, she shaped the flow by being exactly where she needed to be, exactly when it mattered, and Hayes saw it clearly now, not as something unusual, but as something consistent, reliable, a form of leadership that existed without declaration. He stepped slightly closer, his presence acknowledged but not disruptive, and for the first time since she arrived, there was no distance between their roles, no barrier of doubt or assumption, only a shared understanding that had been built without words. And as the morning light grew stronger, filling the tent with a quiet clarity, Hayes realized that what had changed was not the situation, not the war, not the work they faced, but the way he saw the person standing beside him, because he no longer saw a silent observer, he saw someone who understood the moment before it unfolded, and that kind of understanding could not be taught, only recognized when it finally revealed itself. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the station had fully returned, not chaotic, but layered, voices overlapping in controlled patterns, footsteps moving with purpose, the quiet from earlier replaced by a steady flow of decisions that no longer felt rushed. Captain Hayes stood near the central table, observing more than directing, his presence still firm, but no longer pressing down on the room. The difference was subtle, but everyone felt it. Elena worked beside the young medic from earlier. Her movements precise, her attention divided without losing focus. She noticed everything, not in a way that drew attention, but in the way her hands adjusted before a problem could form, a slight repositioning, a small correction, each action preventing the need for something larger. The medic glanced at her more often now, not for permission, but for confirmation, and she gave it without speaking, a nod, a shift, a pause at the exact right moment. Hayes watched this exchange carefully. Recognizing something he had once overlooked, she was not just responding to situations, she was shaping them before they fully existed. A senior medic approached Hayes with a concern about supply allocation, speaking quickly, outlining numbers, possibilities, constraints. Hayes listened, asked a few direct questions, then gave a concise decision, efficient, controlled, the kind of leadership he had relied on for years. But as the medic left, Hayes found his attention returning again, not to the problem he had just solved, but to the quiet space where Elena continued to work, because what she was doing operated on a different level, one that did not rely on commands or structure, but on awareness that could not be easily taught. A brief moment of tension surfaced at one of the side stations, nothing urgent, just uncertainty, a pause where someone was unsure of the next step. Elena noticed it without turning her head, her eyes shifted slightly, tracking the hesitation, then she stepped closer, not inserting herself, but aligning with the moment. "You are holding too long," she said softly, her tone neutral, the words simple. The medic adjusted immediately, the hesitation dissolved, and the flow continued. Hayes saw it clearly now, the way her presence reduced friction, the way decisions became easier around her, not because she took control, but because she removed doubt. He stepped toward her, stopping just within speaking distance. "You do that often," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Elena finished the adjustment she was making before answering. "It is easier to correct early," she said, and again, the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any explanation could. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding the implication, that waiting too long created complexity, that small actions taken at the right time prevented larger consequences later. It was a principle he knew in command, but had not considered in this way, not at this level of detail. A moment passed between them, not silent in the way it had been before, but settled, as if both understood something that did not need to be spoken aloud. The young medic looked up briefly, watching the exchange, seeing not authority being asserted, but something quieter, something earned. Hayes straightened slightly, his gaze moving across the station once more, but now with a different awareness. He was no longer looking for mistakes to correct, he was looking for patterns, for the subtle shifts that indicated where attention was needed, and more often than not, he found that Elena had already seen them, already adjusted them, already moved the situation back into balance before it could drift too far. And in that realization, something settled within him, not a loss of control, but a refinement of it, because he understood now that leadership was not always about being first to act. Sometimes it was about recognizing who already knew when to move, and trusting that instinct. When it revealed itself, the shift did not announce itself, it rarely did. It came in the form of a small inconsistency, a hesitation in movement, a break in rhythm that most would dismiss as fatigue or distraction, but Elena saw it the moment it appeared, not directly, not by staring, but by sensing the change in the room's pattern. One of the senior medics at the far table adjusted his stance, slightly off balance, his hands moving with just enough delay to matter, nothing obvious. Nothing alarming, but enough to create a quiet ripple in the flow. Captain Hayes noticed it a second later, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to locate the source, but before he could step in, Elena was already moving, not quickly, not urgently, just precisely. She approached the table without interrupting, her presence aligning with the space rather than disrupting it. "Your angle is off," she said softly, not a correction meant to challenge, but one meant to restore alignment. The medic paused, glancing at her, then adjusted, the change immediate, the tension dissolving as if it had never fully formed. Hayes watched this carefully, the timing of it, the lack of hesitation, the absence of ego. She had not waited for permission, but she had not taken control either. She had simply acted at the exact moment the situation required it, nothing more, nothing less. The medic gave a short nod, not defensive, not embarrassed, just acknowledging the correction, and continued, the rhythm restored. Hayes stepped closer now, his attention focused, not on the problem, but on the way it had been handled. "You knew before it became an issue," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Elena did not look at him immediately, finishing the alignment she had started before answering. "It was already becoming one," she replied, her tone even, and Hayes understood the distinction, that problems did not begin when they were visible, they began when something first moved out of place, and she operated in that early space, where most people were not yet looking. A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Hayes glanced around the station, seeing it differently now, not as a series of tasks to manage, but as a system of small movements that needed constant awareness. And within that system, Elena functioned like a point of balance, subtle but essential. A young medic approached with a question, hesitating slightly when he saw Hayes standing there, but Elena turned toward him before the hesitation could grow. "Show me," she said, her voice calm, and the medic stepped forward, explaining quickly. Elena listened, her eyes moving between his hands and the setup in front of him. Then she made a small adjustment, just enough to clarify the process. "Like this," she said, and stepped back, allowing him to continue. Hayes observed the exchange, noting the way she guided without overshadowing, corrected without diminishing. It was a form of authority that did not rely on position, but on trust built in real time, and he recognized something in it that he had not considered before, that the strongest influence in a room was not always the one that directed the most, but the one that made everything else work more smoothly. He shifted his stance slightly, his posture less rigid now, not because he had relinquished control, but because he no longer needed to hold it as tightly. Elena returned to her position, her movement steady, unchanged by the attention, and Hayes realized that for her, nothing had changed at all. She was doing exactly what she had always been capable of. It was only his perspective that had caught up, and as he stood there, watching the quiet efficiency of her presence shaping the room in ways most would never notice, he understood something with a clarity that settled deep and stayed there, that the difference between oversight and understanding was not knowledge, but attention, and she had been paying attention long before anyone thought to look. By early afternoon, the station no longer felt like a place reacting to problems, but one anticipating them. The difference subtle yet undeniable. Movements flowed with fewer interruptions, voices carried less tension, and decisions seemed to arrive just before they were needed rather than after. Captain Hayes stood near the center, his attention no longer scanning for errors, but for shifts, the small deviations that signaled where focus should move next. And more often than not, he found that Elena had already moved there, already corrected, already restored balance before anyone else had fully noticed. She worked beside a different team now, rotating without announcement, her presence integrating seamlessly into each space she entered, not changing her pace, not adjusting her demeanor, simply continuing. A medic reached for an instrument and hesitated for half a second. Elena's hand moved slightly, not to take it, but to reposition it within easier reach. The medic continued without breaking rhythm, barely aware of the adjustment, yet benefiting from it. Hayes observed this with growing clarity. the pattern repeating itself in different forms, always subtle, always precise, never drawing attention to itself. He stepped closer, folding his arms loosely, not in authority, but in thought. "You make it easier for them," he said, his voice quieter than it had been at the beginning of the day. Elena glanced up briefly, then back to her work. "It should be easier," she replied, and there was no weight in her tone, no attempt to make a point, just a statement of how things were meant to function. Hayes considered that, the simplicity of the idea, that complexity was not always necessary, that clarity could exist if someone took the time to see what others missed. A senior medic approached with a question about scheduling, his voice steady but carrying the underlying strain of too many decisions made too quickly. Hayes listened, but before he could respond, Elena spoke, not interrupting, but aligning her words with the pause in the conversation. "Switch the order," she said, her tone calm. "The second case will take longer if delayed." The medic looked at her, then at Hayes, waiting. Hayes held the moment for a fraction longer than he normally would have, then nodded once. "Do it," he said, and the decision moved forward, clean, efficient, without debate. The medic adjusted the schedule immediately, the tension easing as the path became clearer. Hayes watched Elena as the moment passed, noting that she had already returned to her work, not waiting for acknowledgement, not measuring the impact of what she had said, simply continuing. He stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You are not guessing," he said, more to confirm what he already understood than to question it. Elena shook her head once, a small, definitive motion. "No," she said, and nothing more. Hayes exhaled slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of recognition, the kind that settles into place when something becomes undeniable. He looked around the station again, seeing the cumulative effect of her presence, not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent, the kind of influence that reshaped outcomes without announcing itself. And he realized that what had changed was not just his perception of her, but his approach to everything around him. He was no longer trying to control every movement, he was learning to recognize where control was already being exercised effectively, and to allow it to continue. A young medic glanced toward Elena again, seeking confirmation without words, and she gave it with the slightest nod. The process continuing without disruption, Hayes remained where he was, not needing to step in, not needing to assert anything, because for the first time since she arrived, he understood that the strongest position in the room was not always the one that spoke first, but the one that saw clearly enough to act at the exact right moment. And in that understanding, the entire station seemed to move with a new kind of confidence, one built not on volume or force, but on quiet precision that held everything together. Without ever needing to be seen, the afternoon light shifted again, softer now, stretching long across the canvas walls as if time itself had slowed just enough to be noticed. The steady rhythm of the station continued, but beneath it there was something new, not visible, not spoken, but present in the way decisions formed and moved without friction. Captain Hayes stood near the entrance, watching the flow from a distance for the first time that day, not positioned at the center, not directing, but observing how the system held together without his immediate presence. And it did, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but with a consistency that had not been there before. His eyes moved across the room, tracing the subtle adjustments, the quiet confirmations, the moments where hesitation might have existed before but no longer did. And at the center of it, though she never placed herself there, was Elena, moving between spaces with the same calm precision, never rushing, never pausing longer than necessary, simply aligning herself with what was needed before it was fully realized. A brief disruption surfaced near the far end, a misunderstanding between two medics over sequencing, their voices low but edged with uncertainty. Hayes saw it immediately, his instinct to step in already forming, but he did not move, not yet. He waited, a deliberate choice now, testing something he had begun to understand. Elena noticed it as well, her attention shifting without turning her head. She stepped closer, not inserting authority, but offering clarity. "You are both right," she said quietly, and the words themselves seemed to ease the tension before she even continued. "But not at the same time," she added, her tone even, and with a small gesture, she reordered their sequence, not correcting either of them, but placing their actions in the right order. The conflict dissolved instantly, replaced by a shared understanding. The medics nodded, continuing without further hesitation. Hayes watched this unfold with a stillness that mirrored her own, recognizing something he had spent years trying to achieve through instruction and structure. She had done it in seconds, without raising her voice, without asserting rank, simply by seeing the shape of the problem and adjusting it before it could expand. He stepped forward now, not to take over, but to acknowledge what he had witnessed, stopping just within her peripheral view. "You do not choose sides," he said, more observation than question. Elena glanced at him briefly, then back to her work. "There are no sides," she replied, and Hayes felt the weight of that settle in a way that extended beyond the moment, beyond the station, into something broader, something he had not fully considered until now. A system worked best not when one part dominated, but when each part was placed correctly. The idea simple, almost obvious, yet rarely practiced with this level of precision. A quiet passed between them, not empty, but complete, the kind that did not require continuation. Hayes looked around once more, but this time there was no need to search for imbalance, because he trusted that if it appeared, it would be seen, not by chance, but by the quiet awareness that had already reshaped the room. He adjusted his stance slightly, less rigid, more grounded, and for the first time since the day began, he allowed himself to step back fully, not as withdrawal, but as recognition, because he understood now that leadership was not diminished by sharing it with someone who did not seek it, but strengthened by allowing it to exist where it was most effective. And as the light continued to soften, casting the station in a calm, steady glow, Hayes realized that the most significant change had not been in the work they had done, but in the way it had been done, guided not by force, not by volume, but by a quiet precision that required no recognition to remain essential. Evening approached again, but this time it did not feel like a return to uncertainty. It felt like a continuation of something that had already settled into place. The station moved with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, not louder, not faster, but steadier, more certain in its rhythm. Captain Hayes stood near the center once more, but his presence no longer pressed against the space, it rested within it. Aligned rather than imposed, his eyes moved across the room, not searching for disruption, but observing how each part held its place. And again, without intention, his attention returned to Elena, not because she stood out, but because she did not. She blended into the movement so completely that only careful observation revealed how much she influenced it. She was assisting at the central table now, her hands moving in quiet coordination with the others, no one directing her, no one questioning her. The flow around her adjusted naturally, as if it had always been that way. A young medic hesitated for a brief moment, uncertain of the next step, and before the hesitation could form into delay, Elena shifted slightly, her hand guiding the sequence without interruption. The medic continued, the rhythm unbroken. Hayes watched this with a growing sense of clarity. What she offered was not instruction, it was alignment. She did not change the structure, she refined it from within. A senior officer entered the tent briefly, his presence sharper, carrying the authority of command from outside this space. He paused, observing the room, his gaze moving across the medics, then stopping on Elena, a flicker of recognition mixed with uncertainty crossing his expression. "Who is she?" he asked, his tone low but direct. Hayes did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the movement of the room. Then he spoke, just as evenly, "She is exactly where she needs to be." The officer glanced at him, expecting more, perhaps a rank, a designation, something that could be recorded and understood within the usual structure. But Hayes offered nothing further, because there was nothing else that mattered in that moment. The officer lingered for a second, then nodded once, accepting the answer in a way that suggested he understood more than he needed to say, and moved on, the brief disruption passing without leaving a mark. Elena did not react to the exchange, did not look up, did not acknowledge the attention. She continued her work with the same steady precision, unaffected by recognition or scrutiny. Hayes observed this with a quiet certainty, understanding now that her consistency was not dependent on how she was perceived. It existed independently, rooted in something deeper than approval or authority. He stepped slightly closer, not to direct, but to stand within the same space, sharing the moment without interrupting it. A brief pause in activity created a pocket of stillness, and in that stillness, he spoke, not loudly, not for the room, but for her. "You changed this place," he said, the words simple, without emphasis. Elena paused just long enough to acknowledge that they had been spoken, then resumed her work. "No," she said quietly, "it was always this way," and Hayes understood, not as contradiction, but as perspective. That the potential had always been there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be aligned, and that what he had mistaken for absence had been presence all along, just unrecognized. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and stepped back, not away, but into a position that no longer required constant assertion, because he trusted what he now understood, that the strength of the room did not come from control alone, but from the quiet precision of those who saw clearly enough to act without needing to be seen. And as the evening light settled into a calm, steady glow, the station continued its work, unchanged in purpose, but transformed in the way that purpose was carried forward. The night settled with a deeper calm than before, not empty, not silent, but steady in a way that suggested everything had found its place. The lanterns cast a warm, consistent glow across the canvas walls, shadows no longer shifting sharply but resting where they fell. Captain Hayes stood near the edge of the station, not at the center, not directing, just present, his posture no longer rigid with control but grounded in awareness. He watched the room move, not as separate actions, but as a single system working in quiet coordination, and within that system, Elena continued as she always had, unchanged, her movements neither slower nor faster, neither more visible nor hidden, simply precise. A medic approached her with a question, his voice low, respectful. She listened, adjusted one small detail, and stepped back, the exchange complete in seconds, no excess, no need for elaboration. Hayes noticed something then that he had not fully understood before. No one questioned her presence anymore, no one hesitated when she stepped forward. The shift had fully settled, not as a moment, but as a new baseline. He moved a few steps closer, his boots quiet against the floor, stopping just within speaking distance. Not to interrupt, but to exist within the same space. Elena sensed him, her hands pausing briefly before continuing, acknowledging without turning. You anticipated it again, he said, his voice even, not surprised, but certain. Elena finished aligning the instruments before answering. It follows a pattern, she replied, and Hayes let that settle, the idea simple, but layered, that what seemed unpredictable often was not. If someone paid close enough attention, a distant sound outside passed briefly, then faded, the world continuing its motion beyond the tent. But inside, the stillness held, shaped not by absence of action, but by clarity of it. Hayes looked around once more, tracing the flow of movement, the absence of hesitation, the way each decision seemed to arrive just in time, and he understood now that what he had witnessed throughout the day was not a series of isolated moments, but a consistent way of seeing. One that operated quietly, without demand, without recognition, yet influenced everything it touched. He turned back to Elena, studying her for a moment, not as an officer assessing a subordinate, but as someone recognizing a truth he had missed. You never needed to prove it, he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Elena paused, her eyes lifting slightly, meeting his for just a moment. No, she said, her tone calm, without weight, and then she returned to her work, as if the answer required nothing further. Hayes nodded slowly, understanding that the absence of explanation had never been uncertainty. It had been confidence that did not depend on being seen. A young medic nearby adjusted his position, working with more assurance than earlier in the day, and Hayes recognized that the effect extended beyond her actions. It had shaped the way others moved, the way they trusted their own decisions, the way they corrected themselves before needing to be told. He stepped back slightly, not withdrawing, but allowing the space to remain balanced. Without his presence at the center, and in that step, there was no loss, only clarity. Because he understood now that leadership was not about filling every silence, not about answering every question before it was asked. Sometimes it was about recognizing when the answer was already present, waiting in the quiet. And as the lantern light held steady and the station continued its work without interruption, Hayes realized that what had changed was not the complexity of the work, but the way it was carried, guided by a precision that did not need to be announced, only trusted once it revealed itself. The final hours of the night did not feel like an ending, they felt like a quiet confirmation, the kind that settles without announcement and stays long after the moment has passed. The station moved with a calm consistency now, not driven by urgency, not strained by uncertainty, but guided by something steadier, something that had revealed itself slowly over the course of a single day. Captain Hayes stood just outside the tent, the cool night air resting against his skin, the distant sounds of the war continuing beyond the horizon, unchanged, relentless. But inside the canvas walls behind him, something had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. He glanced down at his hands for a brief moment, then back toward the entrance, as if measuring the distance between what he had believed that morning and what he understood now. When he stepped back inside, the lantern light met him with the same steady glow, the same quiet rhythm, and there she was, exactly where she had always been, not at the center, not seeking attention, simply working, her presence woven into the structure of the room so completely that it no longer felt separate from it. A medic passed by her, adjusting his approach without being told. Another made a correction before hesitation could form, small shifts, repeated, consistent, the kind that built something larger without ever drawing focus to themselves. Hayes moved a few steps closer, stopping where he could see everything clearly, but without interrupting it, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to question, only something to acknowledge. Elena finished placing the last instrument on a tray, aligning it with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement she had made. Then she paused, not because the work had ended, but because the moment had, and in that pause, Hayes spoke, his voice even, not carrying, not commanding, just present. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, without weight, without defense, and they settled into the space between them without resistance. Elena looked at him, not surprised, not waiting, just meeting the statement as it was. And for a brief moment, there was no difference between them, no rank, no role. Only two people standing in the same understanding. "You were early," she said quietly, and the answer did not correct him, it completed the thought. Hayes let out a small breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement, and nodded once, because he understood what she meant, that he had judged before he had seen, spoken before he had understood, and that the difference between those two moments had changed everything. He stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving the space the same respect she always had, allowing it to remain balanced without forcing his presence into it. The station continued its work, steady, precise, unchanged in purpose but transformed in execution, and as Hayes stood there, no longer needing to direct every movement, no longer needing to fill every silence, he realized that what he had witnessed was not something extraordinary, not something rare, but something often overlooked, the quiet strength of someone who did not need to be heard to be understood, someone who did not need to be seen to shape everything around them. And as the night held its calm and the lantern light remained steady, the final understanding settled fully into place, clear and unshaken. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded recognition, she had not corrected him with words. She had simply done what needed to be done, exactly when it mattered, and in doing so, she had changed not just the outcome, but the way he would see every moment after it, because he would remember that silence was not absence, and that the ones who said the least were often the ones who understood the most.